Hello, here's Jenny. I'm now doing a survey about cultural effects on social spaces. So
hmm
I want to ask, how long have you been in America?
So I came to the U.S. In 2013, so it has been a little over 9 years.
Yeah, quite a long time. And you've been there for this long time. And do you feel any difference between the atmosphere in China and America? Maybe from like,
Yeah, sure.
yeah, from different
Yeah, so I think
aspects?
all of the education pre universities, there was a lot of balance between work and life, right? So it's not just about academics in the U.S. It's
Mm-hmm.
all about a lot of fundamental stuff that you can develop at your younger ages. So that's athletics, performing arts, etc. But when I was back in China, there was a lot of focuses on kind of improving your academic scores,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of emphasis are on how well you can do on tests and quizzes and chapter exams, rather than trying to develop a teenager in a very well-rounded act, I guess. So, athletics and performing arts, those are never the priorities for a kid, but rather, kind of like a uh, add-ons in their lives if they have extra free time. Uh,
Yeah. Mm.
instead of in the U.S., it's more about kind of like a 50-50 balance where
Mm-hmm.
academics and extracurricular activities are rather balanced and similar.
Yeah, I see. And how do you think most American people evaluate China and Australia?
Well, I think for American perspective, because of the political differences between a lot of Western countries and China,
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot of negativity towards China and its political system. That is for sure, right? And especially about kind of current news regarding kind of human rights violation and equality, regarding social credit and system. Going to be a lot of arguments and kind of a disapproval among American aspects in terms of the Chinese political system. So
Yeah.
overall, I think for people who never really do international travels, most Americans do not like China and anything that China does. In terms of Australia, I think the U.S. relations with Australia has been very very neutral
Mm-hmm.
ever since World War II.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no political conflict between these two countries. Both are democratic. There's not a lot of diplomacy going around because Australia doesn't need U.S. resources, and U.S. doesn't need Australian resources either. So I don't see a lot of diplomatic discussions going around. I think Americans think Australians are almost no difference to them in a lot of lifestyles and political structures. So it's very neutral there.
Mm. So how do you evaluate the relationship between China and America and America between Australia by yourself? So do
Well,
you?
I think
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I think the relationship between U.S. and China are rather fragile, right? I mean,
Yeah,
both
yeah.
countries need each other. I mean, China has a lot of raw materials and productions that the U.S. is going to need, right? U.S.
Mm-hmm.
is going to be the biggest buyer from China in almost every single consumer products.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
on the other hand, yeah, I mean, on the other hand, China cannot leave, kind of an ecosystem from the U.S. either, because if you are mass producing so many consumer products and nobody buys them, then everything is gonna go bad too, right? So I think in terms of the economic relationship between China and U.S., uh, either one of the parties needs each other. So
Mm-hmm.
it's almost as if they need to find kind of like a common ground and a balance to each other to make sure that they are relatively with each other, and that's probably going to be the maximum benefit for two countries. So, there's a lot of discussions and things to do here, but ultimately, um, balancing the discussions and making sure that each countries are happy with each other, not only just politically but also economically, is going to be beneficial for every single citizen in two countries, right? But in terms of U.S. and Australia, I really don't see there's any, negative, I guess, things that would happen that damage both countries' relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I also don't see any benefits for them to even increase their relationship. It's almost as if, they don't bother each other, right? I mean, there's just no necessity to kind of increase a bonded relationship, waste money on each other. It's almost as they're very neutral to each other again, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in my opinion, they're very independent, and both countries don't really need each other. So.
Yeah, I like your idea. Yeah. So next question is, like, if we are going to discuss social space, which space will you think
Sure.
at first?
Social space?
Yeah, like you could separate it into like maybe virtual space or physical space. Like if talking about physical space, it could be any public space, for example, maybe museum, shopping center, or yeah, any space that you could think at first. Or which
when I think about social space, I kind of would differentiate it by different ages, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for people who are in the 20s, we will probably think about social spaces like clubs, nightclubs, bars, restaurants. But virtual spaces probably going to be social media, online e-commerce stores, etc. But for people in their 30s and 40s, the physical space will probably going to be more like shopping malls, like you mentioned, outlet stores, and then for virtual spaces, probably going to be more of like a discussion board websites, news websites, etc.
Yeah. So maybe which one is you're more familiar with?
I would say social media. I mean, if you ask anybody, almost everyone spends quite a lot of time in their daily lives in social medias nowadays. So I think that's probably going to be the space where you can really be your true self and kind of express your ideas and comments and any, I guess, advice or recommendations that you have for other people, etc. So social media is probably going to be the most familiar space for me.
Okay. So I want to talk about specific one physical social space. Have you ever been to a library or a museum in America?
Yeah, I go to my school's library all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then for museum, I've gone to quite many of them in the cities, as well as other cities like San Francisco, New York City, etc. Yeah.
Do you feel any difference between Chinese libraries and American one? Like maybe from decoration or any aspects?
I would say in terms of libraries, the Chinese libraries and American libraries are pretty similar. There's a lot of similarities between each other. I mean, there's a lot of quiet spaces, a lot of books, a lot of people who are actually there to study, etc. When I go to the library both in China and the U.S., I see a lot of people doing test preps or like before the exam, etc. So I see a lot of similarities in that.
Yeah.
I don't really see a lot of differences between those two countries.
Okay. So any difference in the museum?
I would say yes, because in my memories, a lot of museums that I visited in China are very historically motivated.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, kind of history trend. They teach you a piece of history that they feel really patriotic about, or, there's some events in the country that are very much needed to be remembered, etc. But in the U.S., I feel like there's not a lot of historical museums, or rather, I would say they're not the most popular ones.
Mm-hmm.
The more popular ones will probably be lifestyle art museum, fine arts
Mm-hmm.
museum, etc., things like that. I'll give you an example. I mean, there are museums in the U.S. For example, in New Orleans, there is a museum called World War II Museum.
Oh,
It's
okay.
quite large, but they're always not as popular as a museum like, let's say, MoMA, so Museum of Modern Arts in New
Mm-hmm.
York City or in San Francisco. They're always going to be quite more popular than a World War II museum in New Orleans. So,
So the focus are different. Okay.
yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Have you read any books about Australian history or Australian arts in a library before?
I,
Or,
I wouldn't I wouldn't say that I have read a single book that is specific to Australian history or Australian life,
mm-hmm.
but I would say that a lot of textbooks in, let's say, political science classes
Yeah.
do mention about, like, economic structure, political structure of Australia. Again, I think Australian government and Australian economy kind of are in kind of like a establishment of kind of like an old British culture. So when you are kind of examining these political structures or economy, it's very much similar to Britain, and they will probably talk about Britain more.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why there's not a lot of kind of a specific book about Australian histories or something like that are available to me in the U.S.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Um, Last two questions. Do you think
Sure.
culture has an impact on public space? And
Oh,
if it does,
absolutely.
yeah, what are the aspects of these effects?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I currently live in this city in the U.S. called New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And New Orleans is in a very, kind of like a special geographic location. It's
Mm-hmm.
in a state of Louisiana, which is one of the most southern state in the U.S. And traditionally, southern states and people from the South get a pretty bad reputations in the U.S. because their political ideas are very conservative. There's a lot of people who are relatively uneducated, and they say that it's more of a kind of an agricultural state where education is not the most important. There's not a lot of smart people there. I mean, there's just a lot of criticisms about southern states
Mm-hmm.
in the U.S. But I would say that New Orleans is a very special exception
Mm-hmm.
with that reputation because of the cultural differences. Because New Orleans, historically was occupied by the French,
Oh.
and there's a lot of French influences in the city.
Okay.
You see the buildings in downtown; they're all French style houses. We have a lot of Catholic churches that are, historically French owned. We have historically famous kind of a genre of music here that is founded here, which is jazz. I mean, there's a lot of history and culture that is within this city that makes this city really special and makes a lot of people who live in New Orleans very proud of themselves of where they come from. So I think cultural aspect definitely reflect and changes a geographic location for sure.
Okay. So, my last question is, for now, I'm trying to do an art project. I want to show the influence of culture background on social spaces. And do you have any suggestions for this project? Or let's say, if letting you to do such an art program, what will you do to demonstrate this idea?
Yeah, so let's just keep using New Orleans as an example. I think
Yeah,
that's
sure.
a great example. You can kind of show, if I were me to do kind of like a project like this, I would do a compare and contrast, kind of like a picture-to-picture framework, right? So I would show some of the pictures and what the houses look like outside of New Orleans, but still in Louisiana and the southern states. What do they look like? And then I would show pictures of houses and people and, the streets of Mardi Gras in New Orleans to show that, oh, wow, there's a huge difference, even though those two cities are,
really
a
close.
couple miles, a couple kilometers away, or like, a couple hours away. They're very, very different, right? I would use that. I would also use audio because, for example, in Australia, you speak English and I speak English too, but, because of the cultural differences, we have kind of like an old Boston, British to Boston and then to Southern accent. And then you have a rather kind of like a countryside British accent, right? So I would use audios to kind of also show the differences, how culture change and influence people's daily life. Music is a part of it, right? So like I mentioned, New Orleans is the founding city of jazz music. And then if you find, kind of like Nashville, Tennessee, that will be kind of like the founding city of rock and roll. And then you go to California, go to like LA, you will find kind of like a lot of West California styles of rap and hip hop, etc. So I would use audio to kind of show the cultural differences as well. And using visual and audio, I think it's a pretty strong tool.
Yeah, multimedia. Yeah. That's a strong point.
Right.
Yeah, okay. I think that's all I want to ask. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think you provide me a lot of specific idea. Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, cool.
Glad to help.
Yeah. Have a good day.
You too.
Yeah, see ya.